The presenters for this panel, which is titled Academic Freedom in Question, Palestine and the Limits of Speech, or of Free Speech, actually. The first presenter is Sherene Seikaly, who is an assistant professor of history at the University of California, Santa Barbara. She is the co-editor of the Arab Studies Journal and the co-founder and editor of Jadaliya magazine online, which you probably all know. Her first book is titled Man of Capital, Scarcity and Economy in Palestine. Has been published by Stanford University Press, will be published by Stanford University Press in 2016, so that's a good. This month, wow, good. The book explores how Palestinian capitalists and British colonial officials used economy to shape territory, nationalism, the home, and the body. The title of her talk today is Histories of the Present, Palestine, Activism, and Academic Freedom.
Thank you so much. I want to, like everyone, thank David and Lubna and also Jeff for inviting me. It's really an honor to be here. I also want to say that this panel is a great one because the three of us know each other from when we were graduate students and organizing. And actually, Samera and I were involved in organizing one of the first students for justice in Palestine at NYU 15 years ago. So it's a really wonderful, I think, moment for us to come back together. As I look through the panel, the program, I'm going to start with this map because if you're following the debate on CNN, there's a journalist who showed this map who has had to subsequently apologize. We can talk more about that in the discussion, but it's a nice opening for some of my comments on history. I was looking through the program and I was struck by the language of assault, siege, and attack. And I want to use the lens of historical accumulation to think through this language of siege. And I'm doing this as a Palestine activist, as a Palestinian, as a historian of the Middle East and Palestine specifically, someone also who has just recently joined the UC system as faculty, having been in Cairo for 5 years, where I had the great gift of living the Egyptian Revolution. So my reflections are going to be traveling between all these different sites and scales, and I would like to try together to expand and constrict the idea and experience of siege, and also to think about the politics of hope. One side of siege is the power of language. Throughout this conference, students, faculty, and activists have powerfully testified to how assaults and attacks on academic freedom are strategies of distraction, tools of diversion that sap energy, resources, and creativity. Phrases themselves are also strategies of distraction and tools of siege. For me, the phrase prohibited speech is one such mode of power. It promises a covert surveillance. It hides behind the malicious power of the past tense, prohibited speech. We only know about the speech. We don't know who's doing the prohibiting or who is deeming the speech prohibited. Even after the uttering of this phrase, it has a long life that haunts the limits of what we can think, what we can speak, and maybe most importantly, what we can imagine. So I know with myself when I'm teaching the history of Israel-Palestine, I have these ghosts that surround me all the time, and I'm trying to think about strategies of banishing these ghosts. And here I want to acknowledge the particular challenges of teaching Palestine, which Tina Matar spoke to yesterday. I think these challenges reflect a political economy where some people have more capital than others. This capital, this power often takes shape in another spectral form, the ghost of objectivity. Who gets to claim the vaunted category of the objective? What does it mean to be biased? It is this political economy of objectivity, of who gets to teach Palestine, that is at the core of the present moment. Indeed, the call for boycott, divestment, sanctions, and the call for Palestinian academic freedom, which we haven't, I think, talked about enough in the last day and a half, is a powerful space to think about also who gets to write Palestinian history. It is not coincidental that in every Israeli invasion or attack on Palestine and or Palestinians since 1948, the target, one of the many targets, has been a Palestinian archive. The story of Khalil Sakakini's daughters as they entered the Hebrew University Library in Jerusalem just after 1967 to find their father's books with his handwriting on the margins, organized neatly on a shelf, is one example of many. The Israeli targeting of Palestinian archives is a state of siege. The evidence, should you still need it, of an ongoing settler colonial enterprise. But the targeting and confiscation of archives works in multiple other ways. They constrain who has what academic freedom to tell which histories. The shards of the colonized archive in their locations in Israeli institutions and libraries are the very material conditions that determine who narrate the past, who writes history, and who gets to wear the warm robes of objectivity. We know from Fanon, right, that objectivity is always against us. But for me, banishing the ghosts of surveillance, of objectivity, and of prohibited speech requires this vigilant attention to the realities of settler colonialism in Palestine, not least of which are the material conditions and impossibilities of writing, teaching, and archiving this history. But the specter of prohibited speech has a broader shadow, and yesterday Lubna evoked the intensive privatization of radical student centers and the university more broadly. Today we confront the firing of tenured faculty based on their lack of civility, another phrase that hides behind the anonymous gowns of authority, consensus, and objectivity. The context of this confrontation is, as Stephen Salaita has powerfully argued, the erosion of tenure itself. The condition of academic labor as an embodiment of precarity, contingency, dependency, and transience informs Salaita's case and many others whose names, unfortunately, we don't always know. Indeed, recent analysis have linked the erosion of academic and life and labor to the death of argument itself, to the intense celebration of stupidity. This celebration has reached a triumphant zenith in the not-so-spectral form of Donald Trump. We are quick to link the triumph of stupidity and the erosion of argument to the neoliberal present, and that is something we should do. But there is historical accumulation here, and history can help us shed light on the dark corners where the ghosts of the present hide. Throughout the conference, many folks have powerfully reminded us of the foundational moment of McCarthyism in this country. There are also other less remembered moments, one of which Sandra brought up this morning, such as that of Angela Davis. Here I am deeply inspired by Nick Moulton's historicization of adjunctification in the context of women's studies and black studies. Moulton reminds us how black and brown students in the 1960s challenged the epistemological foundations of the university. He cautions that adjunctification did not happen all at once. It was gradual. It was contested. Most importantly, it was not a simple system of an economic arrangement, but a political strategy to stem the tide of organized intellectual radicalization. And it is this history of intellectual radicalization and the model of Angela Davis that can speak to the possibilities, perhaps, of constricting siege. Edward Said often reminded us that the United States was the second crucial battlefield, a site of Zionism's moral claims, its political power. But the character of the United States as a battlefield is tied also to its specific configuration as both a settler colony and an empire in a permanent state of war. It was this specific configuration that gave birth to what Christian Bailey spoke about yesterday as an organic Black Palestinian solidarity movement, a movement which itself has built on decades of historical accumulation. This organic movement can help us think again and anew about siege. It was last summer in 2014 when Gaza was under unprecedented assault, even by Israeli standards, that Ferguson erupted in protest following the police murder of unarmed 18-year-old Michael Brown. The uprising in Ferguson invigorated the world, and Arabs and Palestinians, which is the part of the world I was in, with its powerful model of collective resistance. The resonances between Gaza and Ferguson have perhaps received the most attention, but there were many other echoes that resounded with the Arab uprisings more broadly. Many of these echoes were immediately visible. The lone figure in a cloud of tear gas facing down a tank, the bravery of individuals willing to risk life and limb, and the sight of many bodies coming together, if only for a moment, to act as one under the force of military assault. This is an image from Cairo. Also shockingly familiar was the U.S. government's profound militarization and transformation of Ferguson into a laboratory for the latest technology and the violent suppression of political dissent. I followed as events unfolded in Ferguson from Cairo, where I spent the last 5 years, and I took part in sharing tips on tear gas and messages of solidarity. Friends and comrades commented on how the U.S. government's militarization of public space resembled Gaza. Many suggested it looks like the United States is taking tips from Israel. However, it is the United States in this scenario that is decidedly the teacher, because the painful reminder here, and this is an argument of Maya Mikdashi's, is that in the United States, settler colonialism has been so complete and so successful that the world has forgotten that South Africa, Australia, and Israel are all reproductions. We know that the United States provides the financial and diplomatic support that buttresses Israel's unprecedented impunity in contravening international law, but there is a deeper connection in this relationship, one that we must attend to with vigilance. The fact of the matter here is that the United States is also an ongoing settler colonial project, not simply one we can commemorate and move on from. It is a self-reproducing palimpsest of dispossession, confiscation, and genocide, and our task is to see that palimpsest, those layers, with our naked eye. And I think I want to quote here Nur Arakat, who said last week when folks were calling for shutting down Columbus Day, she said, and this is as true for me as it is for her, she says, "I'm a settler despite all the ways that my presence in North America is refracted through my own people's violent displacement." So now that I've expanded the siege, maybe I'll turn to some possibilities and give you just a few thoughts on the politics of hope. I do think the language of siege misses the achievements and strengths of the movement of BDS and Students for Justice in Palestine and Solidarity, Palestine Solidarity more broadly. I think the siege is in a way a sign of strength, not weakness. And I think here it's very important to continue the work that Lubna has begun doing with GUPS and the work that Nadine Nabit has done as well, which is to really record and document the historical accumulation of diasporic organizing in this country as part of that strength. But also, as Lubna has provocatively asked yesterday, if Palestinians are winning the war of words, are they actually winning? And this is, after all, the biggest challenge for the possibility of a politics of hope. That is the situation on the ground. I would suggest here that we take our cues from organizers and activists, revolutionaries, and dissidents waging those battles on the ground. And if I learned anything from living in Egypt, it's really that the most powerful social theorists are the revolutionaries. And I want to just end with a few reflections for you on how I have been struggling with the notion of hope and the notion of despair. Much of what we witnessed in the last 4.5, now almost 5 years in the Arab world in terms of Arab uprisings can perhaps be best summed up in the metaphor of a relentless roller coaster. This roller coaster led many of us to an unknown territory of hope. It also lurched us to altogether new depths of a much more familiar emotion, despair. We witnessed one regime after another crumble to revolutionary calls for change. We saw the old and rotting leaders once donning military gear reeking. We saw the mold that had accumulated through their brutal, corrupt structures cracking under the weight of revolutionary power. But it was just a matter of months, or at best a couple of years, before this irresistible emotion of hope proved dangerously ephemeral, and we saw quickly some of the old leaders reassuming their thrones, and in the meantime, it did not take long for a noxious combination of interests to reconsolidate into new old regimes that looked worse even than the devil we knew. For a while, I've been thinking about this period in Arab and Middle East history as perhaps the worst we have seen since the famine, displacement, and death of World War I. Today, amidst the multiple and ongoing catastrophes of Palestine, also of Iraq, and also of Syria, I fear that we are surpassing this despair. We are witnessing unprecedented heights of dispossession, death, and loss. And on this roller coaster, we seem stuck again between a number of non-choices. The ontological non-choice of a wide variety of authoritarianisms, take your pick, and the epistemological non-choice between apologetics and essentialism. And I'm constantly concerned with how to exit these traps. And as I suggested, one way to survive revolutionary times for me was to conjure the metaphor of a roller coaster, this roller coaster of hope and despair. When I used to use the metaphor, especially when I was living and working in Egypt, I think I imagined that the ride might end in some utopic future. Now what I fear the most is the ride ending. This is not only because the future seems, a utopic future seems almost implausible and naive. It is also because the very spectrum between hope and hopelessness is itself a vital one that we must in some ways try to maintain. Here we can take our cue from the work of theorists Lisa Dugan and the late Jose Munoz, who teach us that it is apathy, not despair, that is the opposite of that risky and fleeting emotion, hope. Thank you.
Sameera Esmeir, who is an associate professor in the Department of Rhetoric at University of California, Berkeley, and she's affiliated faculty with the new PhD program in social science at Birzeit University. Congratulations. Her first book, Juridical Humanity, A Colonial History, tracks the colonial legal history of Egypt and theorizes the rise of what she calls juridical humanity as a technology of colonial rule. She is currently working on a second book with the working title, The Rebellion That Remains, Palestine in the Land of the International. This book tracks 3 Palestinian moments of rebellion revolution under Ottoman rule, British colonial rule, and Zionist colonization. The book tells the story of these struggles and theorizes their political reconfiguration as Palestine gradually entered the new land of the international and its associated legal regimes. The title of her paper today is Sites of Freedom and Divestment, Rethinking the Geopolitical Frame.
We live in a world of struggles, attacks, and counterattacks. This morning, this afternoon, as we reflect upon the attack on academic freedom, of those who produce anti-Zionist knowledge about Palestine, there are also a series of deadly and political attacks on the decolonizing struggle of the Palestinians. It is not a coincidence that these attacks unfold at the same moment in time. They share a common field of intervention and a common target. What they share is certainly not the suppression of speech or free inquiry as such. They share the opposition to some modes of action, whether intellectual or political, as well as to particular sensibility, an opposition to a particular sensibility in relation to how the world is organized around access of freedom and unfreedom. In my remarks today, I would like to unpack and hopefully get closer to those modes of action and sensibilities under attack. But to do so, I will first have to step back from the umbrella concept of academic freedom and address instead 4 related inquiries, which should lead me to the intervention I would like to make about the necessity, a simple, really, intervention at the end of the day, the necessity to distinguish between different kinds of academic freedom if we are to understand what exactly is under attack today. So the first inquiry really intersects with what Sherene spoke about, and these are the conditions of possibility of academic freedom. I ask this question not in general, but also not in relation to Palestine, because we have educated ourselves enough about the material conditions of colonization that make free inquiry and teaching much more challenging, if sometimes not impossible. But I would like to ask this question about the colonial state of Israel. What are the conditions of possibility of free academic production and circulation of knowledge about Palestine in that colonial institutional setting? The second inquiry is the following. If we live in a world that has come to be divided geopolitically along lines of freedom and unfreedom, the free and the repressive, the authoritarian and the democratic, progressives and conservatives argue that, to what extent does asserting freedom in the land of the free reproduce this division of the world, to which a free academic inquiry must also critically address itself? Or in other words, what is the geopolitical distribution of academic freedom in our world, and how might our struggle to advance academic inquiry here not validate this division? The third inquiry is, how does BDS respond to this division of the world between the free and the unfree? Might it be that one of the most intriguing and interesting interventions of BDS is precisely the undoing of this geopolitical framing of the world as divided between the free and the unfree? That is, by positing Israel, which is taken to be a site of freedom in the dominant geopolitical imaginary, as a candidate for divestment and boycott, does not BDS unsettle this geopolitical frame? And finally, might it therefore be that the practice of academic freedom is most challenging and therefore most under attack when it shares with BDS the sensibility that does not abide by this geopolitical imaginary, and in the process undoes itself as well, undoes itself as pure freedom? My objective, to be sure, is not to dismiss academic freedom, a practice, a value, and a right that has been won over through a series of historical and contemporary struggles. My objective is rather to suggest that the kind of academic freedom under attack is one that shares with the Palestinian struggle a vision that disrupts the geopolitical frame and therefore the conventional distinction between sites of freedom and unfreedom, and therefore disrupts itself as academic freedom in the process. And I want to suggest that this is precisely what is under attack, the disruption of academic freedom of itself, and we might as well own it. So let me begin with this, and I promise I'll finish in less than 20 minutes. So I'm writing a book, as Nouri said, about Palestine from the 19th century onward. We're under Ottoman, British, and Zionist rule. I traveled to London, to Istanbul, to Geneva, to New York. I couldn't go to Beirut, but why do I need that? Most of my research, and as I end up compiling more archival sources, I end up visiting Israeli archives and libraries, as Sherene mentioned. And that is intriguing. We know that the conquest of territory inevitably results in the conquest of archives, texts, and documents, again, as Sherene mentioned. But less appreciated is the fact that these conquered texts and archives are precisely what makes possible the production of knowledge about Palestine. Zionist colonial conquest created the conditions of possibility of free academic inquiry for Israeli academics, or for academics who live there and have access to that place. Let's distinguish this conquest from state projects of collecting documents to construct institutional official memories. At issue is not archive fever from which most nation-states suffer. At issue is the fact of conquest, the annexation of a past to a new entity that had the military capacity to claim that past, and this should be clear here, on this land. Without conquest, without colonization, the practice of academic research about Palestine in Israeli academic institutions would have been impossible. Now, this might be a basic point, but its importance is not only historical or factual, but also political. The argument that BDS violates the academic freedom of Israeli academics does not account for the fact that the conditions of possibility of this freedom is conquest. But my point is also not simply to point out the violent origins of certain freedoms. The free sea, free trade, all have violent colonial origins. My point is rather to suggest that academic freedom is first and foremost a practice, rooted, as Sherene said, in material conditions, not only in an idea and a value to be protected. Israeli academics can claim that BDS violates their academic freedom precisely because they have been enabled to practice such academic research and inquiry. The argument against violation, their argument against violation, in other words, is also an assertion of privilege. But the privilege of academic freedom was not only conferred to Israeli academics by conquest, it is also conferred by particular geopolitical distribution of freedom, whereby the West, including Israel, is the site of academic freedom, and the non-West, as much as some of us here in the room may not like this vocabulary anymore, is the site of unattainable freedom that requires either divestment or protection from the outside. So I turn now to my second point, that is that the world is divided, continues to be divided between the free and the unfree, and this is certainly not only a conservative vision. Progressive political vocabulary oftentimes relies on this imagery of unfreedom, repression, despotism, censorship in order to construct freedom. This imagery and the world divided in accordance to it are central to several progressive academic campaigns. Consider, for example, faculty and student-led opposition to the construction of the NYU campus in Abu Dhabi, which I completely support the opposition to. But consider the campaign. The campaign argues that the United Arab Emirates does not tolerate dissent and labor, and therefore labor there is, the conditions of labor are conditions of slavery. I mention this particular campaign, similar to Yale in China, for example, not because I dispute the depiction of what's happening in the Gulf countries. Quite to the contrary. Laborers have gone on strike and have reported the dreadful conditions, and we have reports of the dreadful conditions under which they labor. What concerns me, however, in this episode is that at its core, it posits NYU as redeemable and Abu Dhabi as not. But NYU, like Abu Dhabi, had its own history of exploitation. It had contracts with sweatshops in Bangladesh, that it took student activism for many years in order to change and amend these contracts. Nevertheless, and its involvement in Lower Manhattan is also now covered more and more in changing the real estate and the face of the city. Nevertheless, despite its history, NYU can be shamed for such violations, whereas shaming Abu Dhabi or other countries in the Gulf or the United Arab Emirates is unimaginable. These countries can be forced through contracts and economic pressures into new arrangements, but NYU is expected to be capable of adjusting its practice to its supposed values of freedom. Would anyone even entertain the thought of the violation of academic freedom of scholars in Abu Dhabi who might suffer from the shutting down of NYU Abu Dhabi? Would we even ask this question? My point then is that in many progressive academic campaigns in which I participate, the world is also divided into two parts. On the one hand, there are regions of academic freedom in which there are occasional attacks and assault, as we've been hearing here, and yet freedom is somehow thought to be redeemable. On the other hand, there are regions in which freedom is always deniable, from which we here must divest, while also offering our support to those who fall victims there. These are, in other words, sites of freedom and sites of divestment, sites in which freedom is occasionally threatened but ultimately understood to be restorable, and others in which freedom is never attainable, always necessitating external intervention in the form of protection or divestment. Such is the geopolitical distribution of freedom and divestment, despite the ongoing attacks on academic freedom in the land of the free. So I want to suggest, and this is my third point, that perhaps one of BDS's most important contributions is the questioning of this geopolitical distribution of freedom and divestment. By calling to boycott, and we should discuss the difference between to boycott and to divest, by calling the call to boycott Israeli academic institutions, which are understood to be sites of free academic inquiry, BDS challenges the division of the word. It calls for boycott and divestment from one land of freedom. In so doing, it's important to note, BDS does not violate academic freedom, but it violates the principle that locates it in one part of the world and locates divestment in another. It threatens the divisive logic that posits certain countries as immune to acts of international solidarity and divestment. BDS, in other words, rejects the argument that there are sites in the world that can be left super-sovereign to redeem themselves by themselves, and proposes instead the principle of solidarity as a check. It seems to me that this is one of the most challenging aspects about BDS. Had BDS been practiced against so-called failed states or quasi-sovereign states such as the United Arab Emirates or Saudi or even China, we would hear less opposition to BDS. A whole vision of the word is questioned in this call using the world's master's tools, international law, which I reject. So, to conclude, and I will conclude, let me return to academic freedom, the academic freedom under attack on U.S. campuses, and think through its relationship to unfreedom. As I already suggested, the conditions of possibility of academic freedom practiced in Israeli institutions is unfreedom, a sense of conquest. Meanwhile, the conditions of possibility of freedom for Palestinians is precisely their struggle also under conditions of unfreedom. These are two distinct modalities and relationships between freedom and unfreedom. What about the U.S.? Perhaps we could think of academic freedom in the U.S. as implicated in unfreedom in precisely these two senses, the colonial Israeli and the anti-colonial Palestinian. On the one hand, the practice of academic freedom in the U.S. is indebted to early colonial conquest and to contemporary wars of occupation. Consider the archives at Stanford University Hoover Institute that consist of documents taken recently from Iraq that we as scholars can now go and research. The practice of academic freedom in the U.S. is also indebted to the geopolitical imaginary I spoke of. On the other hand, the struggle for academic freedom, and I emphasize the struggle as opposed to the right, the struggle for academic freedom in relation to the Middle East unfolds from within conditions of unfreedom. Lara Deeb and Jessica Winniger's recent book on anthropology's politics shows the forces that discipline and shape research on the Middle East. They detail how academia is infused with sexism, Islamophobia, Zionism, and so on and so forth, and how these force particular trajectories in research and teaching. So if our practice of academic freedom, academic freedom in the U.S. is implicated in unfreedom in those two ways. And if our practice of academic freedom is to be responsible, we must understand it not as an umbrella concept. There are different iterations of academic freedom. In some cases, its conditions of possibility are conquest, expansion, annexation, and total devastation. In others, academic freedom is a value that can be reinstated and redeemed even after periods of assaults, but only in certain particular super-sovereign states. But there is also the understanding of academic freedom as a struggle from within conditions of unfreedom, coupled with a sensibility that refuses to split the worlds between sites of freedom and sites of divestment. It is this freedom. It is the freedom that associates itself. It is this freedom that associates itself with the Palestinian struggle of freedom, while risking having to inhabit parallel grounds of repression. It is this latter freedom that is clearly under attack on U.S. campuses, but its critical capacities are many, and we might as well just own them. We might as well embrace those critical capacities because this particular freedom I'm thinking about, this gesture, does not take academic freedom to be an inherited given, complete in itself. It does not seek to protect academic freedom as an essential characteristic of some areas in the world. In short, it does not feel assaulted, but understands itself to be occupying a field of struggle. Perhaps then, the many present-day attacks on academic freedom in different parts of the world show the world for what it really is, undivided along axis of freedom and unfreedom. And perhaps without intending it, the assaulting powers effectively intensified the assaulting powers on academic freedom effectively intensified academic solidarity with the Palestinian struggle by showing both to be struggling from parallel grounds of unfreedom. That I sign on to. That academic freedom I would sign on to. Thank you.
Our third speaker, he's at UC Riverside. His name is Jeffrey Sachs, who's Associate Professor of Arabic and Comparative Literature. He recently published a book titled Iterations of Loss, Mutilation and Aesthetic Form, Ash-Shidyaq to Darwish, from Fordham University Press, 2015, and was the translator of a volume collection of poetry by Darwish entitled Why Did You Leave the Horse Alone? لماذا تركت الحصان وحيدا? I ask that question every day. He's presently writing two books. The first is called Simplicities, a Colonial Archive, and the second, For Decolonization, the Lyric Poem and the Question of Palestine. The title of his talk today changed a bit, so it's no longer translating the question of Palestine, counterinsurgency, and the right to speak, but just one word, or actually two words, Thanatos Semitism.
As Nuri mentioned, the title of this changed. I was telling Sarah yesterday, I think it's definitely the paper's fault. I don't know if it's mine. I would hesitate to say it was something I freely chose. I'll share that the title is Thanatos Semitism. So here we go. I would hardly want to be intolerant. The UC Board of Regents is presently formulating what it takes to be principles against intolerance, and it has invited, on intolerably short notice, I might add, what it has called public input. I'll offer the following. Tolerate Zionism. This would be, minimally, the imperative we're asked to accept. This imperative includes within itself, as it forces, mobilizes, and sets to work these two precious words, tolerate and Zionism. I'd hardly want to have to say anything about Zionism or its state. Not only the state of Zionism, its condition, pre or post, its faring well or not, as if it mattered, but the Zionist state. Of whatever might be said, and who would want to have to say anything about Zionism, I'll have to share that I can't tolerate it. I had wanted to speak about the freedom to speak in relation to the question of Palestine. Are we free to translate the question of Palestine and to speak of it freely? I wanted to ask. And I wanted to relate this question to the American wars of counterinsurgency, from Iraq and Afghanistan to Los Angeles and Ferguson. In the settler colony, Israel or America, for example, counterinsurgency works to control, subjugate, domesticate, and eliminate populations in the interest of the state form and its terms of social coercion. Laleh Khalili has written a very beautiful book about counterinsurgency. Perhaps some of you are familiar with it, and I'd like to share a passage from it here. So this is a citation. Methods of population control, she writes, have differed in settler colonial counterinsurgencies, and they have entailed expulsion, encirclement, or suppression of the indigenous inhabitants, and ultimately their expropriation. land and territory, and emphatically not the indigenous population, have continued to be the prize in settler colonialism, and as such, violence has always been used more swiftly, punitively, and ferociously. If, between quotation marks, improvement has at all appeared in the settler colonial discourse and the practice of population control, it has essentially been as a euphemism for making acquiescent and legible populations. Counterinsurgency, Khalili suggests, works to install legibility. Strategies of state violence and forms of militarized policing are also strategies of interpretation. The reading practices of the colonial state are not only coercive, but they reorganize the field of sociality in quite particular terms. This reorganization, this rendering legible of the social field, is precisely tolerance. A Christian discourse on social control, tolerance is not only a practice of coerced legibility and hierarchized subordination, and it is not only a project of recognition, where the self is to recognize itself and others as legible beings through the cultivation of their humanity, autonomy, and freedom. Tolerance is not only this, but it is also, one might add, a practice where the self, and if there are any, becomes a locus for the domestication of political and social interruption. The politely controlled forms of interpretation privileged in what calls itself tolerance, and if also, of course, literature classes, mirror the forms of social and juridical violence, which it ought to be our task to critique. But must we tolerate Zionism? Compulsively imposing itself since 1948 and earlier and until our own day, and repeatedly creating new and ever more destructive facts on the ground, devastating a world brought to you, care of Barack Obama, Hillary Clinton, George Bush, or whoever, Zionism would be more than just a sign of the times. A machine for the translation of beings and places, languages and names, forms of sociality and understandings of relation, Zionism divides between and within, as in, for example, the recent reportage of the New York Times, which repeatedly tells us that while Palestinians are attackers and terrorists on the side of animality, violence, and death, Israelis are innocent civilians, moral soldiers, or simply bystanders. They are immediately and implicitly on the side of civility, peace, and life. The Times writes in a recent article, here's the quotation, "The death of an Eritrean migrant who was shot and beaten by a mob that mistakenly believed he was a Palestinian attacker set off a round of soul-searching on Monday, amid the jittery atmosphere sweeping Israel in a wave of unrest," end quote. Jewish Israelis staged in this sentence as tolerant beings, remorseful for mistakenly killing an Eritrean, are to belong to a history of Euro-enlightenment. They are beings who can tolerate others. But what calls for tolerant remorse in the perspective of this article is not that a man was killed, but that he was not Palestinian. If the New York Times teaches us something, it teaches us that the Palestinian, unlike the Eritrean migrant, is killable. The presupposition is not a moral one. It is not that Palestinians, unlike Eritreans, ought to be killed or not. Settler colonial violence is in this way indifferent with respect to Palestinian lives. What is presupposed is juridical. If the Israeli state is founded through the expropriation, expulsion, and killing of Palestinians, then these events are not historical or empirical accidents, events which may be mournfully located in time, but are constitutive for the state and its juridical form. Not simply outside of the settler colony and its logic, and not simply an object of its death-imparting force, the Palestinian is constitutive as a being that is permanently killable for the institution of the Zionist state. the founding violence of the state, and it is a violence that is repeated in ever newly expansive, acute, and intensified ways up until today, and in Gaza and beyond. This violence is congealed, as it were, in the state's form and as its ongoing colonizing practice, appearing in each instance as if he or she were a kind of juridical ontological menace. The Palestinian represents the permanent threat of the disruption, dissolution, and disappropriation of the settler colony. Edward Said memorably wrote that to call Zionism racism would be to mute the particularity of its terms and the destructive force of its colonial history and practice. Racism is too vague a term. Zionism is Zionism, he wrote. Not simply racism and more than anti-Semitism, the terms for Zionism's death sentences, the terms that adjudicate, naturalize, and call for its repeated execution of Palestinians are, I wish to argue, Thanatos Semitic. These terms disperse and distribute death between and within, conscripting Jews to the institution of the state and exposing Palestinians to its compulsively death-imparting violence, dividing the world into those beings who ought to be tolerant on the one hand, and on the other, those who ought to be tolerated, those who ought to be either pedagogically civilized, coercively managed, or simply killed. The terms Zionism privileges are precisely tolerant. They are the terms of tolerance, and they reach, and this should hardly be a surprise, into the history of Europe. To get a handle on these terms, I'd like to call as a witness Hegel and his early theological writings. I wonder if you'll be able to tolerate it. Hegel has the following. So this is the Abraham stuff in Hegel. Hegel has the following to say about Abraham, right? Abraham, born in Chaldea, had in youth already left a fatherland in his father's company. Now in the plains of Mesopotamia, he tore himself free altogether from his family as well, in order to be a wholly self-subsistent, independent man, to be an overlord himself. Hegel continues, just with his herds, Abraham wandered hither and thither over a boundless territory without bringing parts of it any nearer to him by cultivating and improving them. Had he done so, he would have become attached to them and might have adopted them as parts of his world. The land was simply given over to his cattle for grazing. The water slept in deep wells without living movement. Digging for it was laborious. It was dearly bought or struggled for, an extorted property, a necessary requirement for him and his cattle. The groves which often gave him coolness and shade he soon left again. In them he had theophanies, appearances of his perfect object on high, but he did not tarry in them with the love which would have made them worthy of the divinity and participant in him. He was a stranger on earth, a stranger to the soil and to men alike. So that's the end of the citation. A stranger among men, with them but not of them, right? Quote, among men he was always a foreigner, Hegel clarifies. Abraham can't relate. He wanders persistently hither and thither, incapable of cultivating and improving the land, not able to labor. The Jew, in Hegel, is unlike the Greek. The Greeks are on the side of beauty. The Jews are on the side of, quote, animal existence, chatter, ugliness, and abjection. The Greeks, Hegel continues, were to be equal because all were free, self-subsistent. The Jews equal because all were incapable of self-subsistence. The Jews, for Hegel, are unable to raise themselves up and fly. Quote, these young never became eagles, end quote. He writes, condemned to the earth and yet without a territory of their own, the Jews in Hegel go nowhere. They remain like Abraham, cut off. Hegel continues, in relation to their God, they rather afford the image of an eagle, which, by mistake, warmed stones, showed them how to fly, and took them on its wings into the clouds, but never raised their weight into flight or fanned their borrowed warmth into the flame of life. Abraham, in order to be tolerated, is to raise himself up and become Christian. And so, too, in Zionism, is the Jew. To put what I wish to argue in a sentence, the Jew is to Zionism as it is to Christianity. If in Christianity the Jew is to be raised up and conserved as the Christian, this would be the moment in Hegel where the Jews would take flight as if they were so many well-taught eagles. So too in Zionism, the Jew, in order to become itself, must sacrifice itself and become a Zionist. It's as if the playbook came directly from the Gospel of John. Here's the cite. For God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, so that whoever believes in him should not perish but have eternal life. For God sent his Son into the world, not to condemn the world, but so that the world might be saved through him. Saving the world, if only that of the Jews. Zionism, in its staging of its relation to the Jew, is Christianity. Right? And so this is an opening of there's a lot of writing behind this, right? Like people working on this. More precisely, it is the appropriation, both the internalization and externalization by Jews of the perspective Christianity takes toward them. And it is more than that, and if minimally, a Christian practice for the interpretation of Jewish history, staging its past as a decrepit one that is to be left behind, and the terms would be precisely the ones I've underlined in Hegel. The Jew, as he or she is coerced to become the Zionist, separates him or herself from her or his past by killing it and burying it safely in another time. In Zionism, the Jew is to be saved by the settler colonial state, given over to it, as he or she is delivered from wandering to history, religion to modernity, and death to life. Thanatos Semitism, then, the unequal, asymmetrical imparting of death, brought to neighborhoods near you, care of the Israeli state. If in Zionism the Jew and her or his life and death is promised to the state, the Palestinian is a being who may and who must be killed. The juridical form of the Israeli state is fantastically theological. It presents itself, after all, as if it created, right? As if it made the desert bloom from nothing. Peace, the great Palestinian poet Mahmoud Darwish wrote, is the acknowledgement in public of the truth. What have you done with the ghosts of those you have killed? Refusing to seal the past into the past, refusing the reading practices of the Zionist project and its state, Darwish interrupts the presumed coherency and juridical stability of the settler colony. What this interruption teaches is that if, for Zionism, the Palestinian must be killed, if the execution of the Palestinian arrives as an imperative, then her or his life and her or his death commands and compels the Israeli state. The settler colonial state is not free, then, not to address itself, if in the most brute and devastating terms, to those whose land it occupies, from 1948 and until today. If the events unfolding in Palestine and in Israel, now and in the past, recall us to something, it would be to a relentless critique of the state form, not only the juridical form of the Zionist state, but the forms of relation and of life, of living and of dying, that it continues to coerce. Thanks.
We have 15 minutes for questions.
I've taught intercultural relations at Mount San Jacinto College for about 20 years in sociology. During that time, I also volunteered with the Israel Defense Forces. and I'll be doing that again this next spring. So, obviously, I see you shaking your head. Okay. I think what I heard, and I just arrived here 30 minutes ago, okay. But what I understand is that what I heard from the speaker is it's not necessary to tolerate Zionists. Is that right? Okay, that's okay. It's pretty simple stuff. So, if we don't, if you're not going to tolerate Zionists, what are you going to do with them?
Yeah, let's have a radical shift in topic. I do notice that there seems to be a constant shuttling between the ability to articulate some notions that are perhaps at the edge of our ability to actually shape and articulate them, and that are coming out of the experience of student and faculty of color who are militating and who are activated here in North America, and in their, as we've been calling them, organic association with uprising globally on the one side, and on the other, a kind of return to the political economy of redemption or the unredeemable that Samera was laying out for us, and I think we just saw an instance of that. So I'm going to represent the other side in this violent bifurcation, which I think is both unnecessary, unproductive, and obscurantist. And I'd like to shift to another way of approaching the affective economies that have been highlighted in these three papers, even as they're talking about, in various ways, geopolitical epistemologies that are materializing and that rewrite our histories, and even our definitions of what constitutes materiality. The materiality of an archive, or is it the materiality of, say, the psychic life of grade school children in the OPT? Those are discrepant materialities having to do with different times, past, the future. What I'm leading up to is the difficulty of articulating revolutionary joy. Joy is an affect that is painful, uplifting. It has wild temporalities like your roller coaster, which I loved, but I heard in these papers a reaching into an archive of theoretical articulations. I heard Fanon, I heard Rancière, I heard Derrida. I heard a lot of these figures, and I just want to hear more, I think, from all of you, because in different ways, performatively in Jeff's case, right? Performatively, you were channeling some of this combination of rage, righteousness, despair, joy, etc. What I'm not suggesting is that we merely talk about our emotions. I think these affects are shaping. I think they actually catalyze what we called organic yesterday. And I'd like to talk about it in ways that are not completely colonized by the old definitions or the old conversations that certainly our students, whom we heard from yesterday, are exiting. They have unsealed the enclosure of the current subsumption of terms and of descriptions and of naming. And I'd just like to hear more about this.
I just want to offer a little clarification. Maybe we can talk more. I just wanted to be clear that I did not at any point say that we should be intolerant of any individuals. In other words, I did not say that we should be intolerant of Zionists. I said that I am not able to tolerate Zionism. And maybe you shouldn't either. But I want to say two things. So first, and you could kind of feel that there are a few papers kind of shuttling through in here together, touching upon each other. This was written at different phases, and then all of a sudden I received that we saw this email about principles against intolerance, and then that kind of colonized the paper in relation to the question of sort of reading anti-Semitism and all of this. But I do want to share on the question of toleration. It seems to me that this is a deeply violent discursive practice that obviously has a colonial history. It has a history in relation to race. It has a history in relation to religion. And so, if we're going to talk about something like toleration, it seems to me that we should open up that conversation, right, and think about toleration as a coercive social practice that organizes beings, that hierarchizes beings, that directs violence in particular kinds of ways, rather than as the way it seems to be presented in contemporary discursive frames, where it's this kind of benevolence, right, which is itself, an extremely significant colonial gesture. And so I think I would want to put the scene of tolerance in conversation really with both of your papers around sort of like we should really think about the fact that this is a settler colonial space, right? And so how is that impacting the terms that we're already using, maybe in perhaps in ways that we need to rethink? And in particular, how does that inflect the ways that terms that in mediated circumstances and mass-mediated contexts get shuttled around, right? A word like tolerance, for example, all of a sudden doesn't have a history, right? And so how do we think about that, right? And so I feel like that was, in terms of both of your papers, I feel like that was a moment that I was trying to learn from, right? On the score of Zionism, I would just want to say, and on the score of the way that you framed your question, I am not in terms of how one can understand the use of the word tolerance in a contemporary American mediated context. I would not wish to be intolerant of anyone, insofar as they're a person. I mean, I don't know. Am I a person? How many people am I? I mean, that's a whole other question. Someone else has to figure that out. I really don't know. But I would certainly not want to be intolerant of any human being who's there with me. We're hanging out. Maybe we're having a beer, whatever. I wouldn't want to be intolerant of a person. And so in the way you framed your question, there was this slippage from, right, of not tolerating Zionists to not tolerating Zionism. And I would want to think about that framing of the question, right? So that would be. I don't know if either of you guys would want to share something or intervene in some kind of way or turn on your. Shall I turn on your microphone?
I guess one question would be to address. I don't want to take up this question of tolerance.
Okay, don't do it. No, you don't have to. No, because
Yeah.
Dina also asked a different.
Okay.
Oh, yeah,
I
you can
see.
skip that. You can skip. No,
Okay.
don't.
It's difficult to be living in the age of tolerance and be fighting settler colonialism. I mean, it's just like two different eras combined in one. So the joint temporalities here are beyond me. Okay, that aside. Dina, I just would like to say one thing, that I had several phrases of joy in my paper as I wrote it, and I deleted them all. And I actually wrote the joy in this particular kind of struggle and discovery of sort of thinking about academic production of knowledge as circulation and the attempt to fight for it. As generating joy. I think also hearing others in the room this morning, I'm sorry I missed yesterday's, I was teaching, hearing others in the room this morning, hearing the first panel, people were pretty happy that they made it on certain lists. There was joy, and it's impossible to miss it, right? People are happy that they are, because their voice is heard. It means that then, I mean, I'm not Arendtian, but it means the kind of speech that is being put forward is being listened to and matters somehow. And therefore, there is joy in that recognition. It's a twisted kind of recognition. But this is only one kind of joy. I think there are other kinds of joys, of other formations of joy that we could talk about. But I think I will just say that as long as we think of academic freedom as a right to be protected and we appeal to administrative institutions to protect that right, there is no joy in academic, in that sort of conception. But if academic freedom goes back, and I'm hesitant, I'm really hesitant with the vocabulary. I personally with the vocabulary of academic freedom, so I'm trying to do something with it without redeeming it. But if on the other hand, it is conceived of from the grounds of struggle, I think joy is possible, and other kind of affects are possible, and finding ways to overcome the juridical state also becomes possible, and that's sort of the version I would sign on to, if I am to sign on to academic freedom.
So I want to just add a couple of things about joy. It may be hard for me to talk about this without crying, because I did feel more joy than I've ever felt in my life after the revolution. I would go out onto the street and people's body language had changed. the way they walked down the street had changed. The way the air felt had changed. And it was all affect. I mean, it was all emotion, intense emotion. And it's gone. And it's that fleeting sense of joy. And it's beautiful, and I'm glad I tasted it, right? And I think I did try to say that, you know, for me, the people that I tried to listen to theorize that experience were the revolutionaries. I think they are the social theorists. I am not so convinced that people have been able to step out of the old binaries. I'm not so convinced of that. I would love to believe that. I think one of the binaries people haven't stepped out of is actually perceiving themselves as social theorists. And I've been involved in several collaborative frameworks where I bring together researchers and journalists and activists and try to really create this space to say, you've done all this. Theorize it. And you've theorized it, document it in some ways. Document the labor that you've done through experience, and people are very tired, and I'm just talking about Egypt. I'm not talking about, I'm not talking about here. So I think that attention to emotion is very, very important to me, and thinking about it and decolonizing it. And I actually also wanted to bring in a more joyful scene from Palestine right now, which I'm sure everybody, or I'm not sure, but maybe some people in the room have seen, which is the Debka stone thrower. And he's just marvelous, right? He's dancing and joyful, and yeah, I think it's crucial.
Sherene, excuse me for a comment rather than a question. I could probably cheat and turn it into a question, but I won't. When you said it's gone, maybe you're gone. That is, you're gone from that site. But I don't think it's gone. I mean, you and I discussed at dinner last night that Ahmed Maher's comment that we failed is something that started a whole set of ideas for me, and I'm writing in a different way, more hopeful way, because I don't think it failed at all. And people have picked it up and are working on a number of projects on the ground. And the same in my own research area, which is Sudan. Yes, they failed to overthrow the military government, but they didn't fail in so many ways. I mean, you said the body language changed. If you went back to Cairo, here's my question. If you went back to Cairo, would you think that you would not see that body language at all?
So, I mean, I've been in denial that I left Cairo since I came to California. So I've actually been there 5 times for long periods of time. And you're right to say that, of course, it's not all gone. I'm not saying it failed. I don't have the tools to assess. I'm not in that position of assessment. I was saying the joy is gone. The joy, the freedom that I felt in my body is not there, and it's not there for my friends. That's what I'm saying.
Just a brief comment. I appreciate y'all's analysis, including critique of Zionism and what it represents. But and I certainly written critically as well. But in the cause of academic freedom, I think it's also important to recognize that we should be open to being allies, welcoming allies among people who may consider themselves Zionists, who also who may oppose the occupation, but and the fundamental thing is they support academic freedom for everybody, and so I certainly think that critical discourse on Zionism is appropriate and should be and should be allowed without any kind of repression. As you pointed out, it's not against Zionists, but about Zionism, and that when it comes to the fundamental issues we're talking about for this conference, to welcome allies who may come from a variety of different political perspectives.
I think that's a comment, but if you want to comment on it.
I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. I only. No, I don't want to comment. I don't know. And you do? Oh my God.
Go for it.
Should you? Yeah.
Go for it.
Maybe I shouldn't, but I'm tempted.
No,
Yeah,
you should.
go for
And I'm
it.
trying to think about if.
We're pressed by time.
Okay, I'm trying
Yes,
to
that-
discover like how could one respond to that? Can I respond joyfully? I've never
Dabka,
able to be
dabka.
happy. I have no idea. Right? I know. Fuck. It's no. I mean,
I think
I don't know, yeah.
no.
Let's let
I
someone
have a
else have something to
response.
say.
I think one of the ways in which we talk about academic freedom is as an abstraction that
That's
stands.
right. So
And-
that's right. Yeah,
That's
no,
good.
that's
That's good.
Very good.
And I think many of us here were trying, and during the past couple of days, I imagine, not only today, from what I'm hearing, is to bring it down to earth, to bring that academic freedom abstraction down to earth, and to speak about the kinds of issues that are being signified by particular knowledges. Then we're destined to get into a disagreement. But it's not so bad.
Yeah.
We can disagree and we can struggle against each other. And I don't think that this itself is necessarily bad. And fearing that and going, if you're afraid of that and resorting to that abstraction, to abstraction that can unite everyone, is perhaps interesting, but it's a depoliticizing move, extremely depoliticizing, common. Indeed common, and many academics would agree with you. But let's just understand that its risks are depoliticization and an invention of a fabrication of agreement where none exists. That would be my...
Beautifully done.
Thank you.
So I want to thank the panelists for a lively and provocative set of papers.